Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1844 when the disappearance occurred. In the humid quarters of New Orleans, where the Mississippi curved like a crescent moon, the Rousseau family maintained one of the most respected households in the French Quarter. Their three-story home on Bourbon Street, with its wrought-iron balconies and courtyard fountain, stood as testament to generations of prosperity built on the sugar trade. It was there, on the evening of September 12th, that Julienne Rousseau was last seen in the company of a free woman of color named Celestine Hartwell. By morning, neither could be found. The search that followed would uncover a series of rooms without doors, passages that led nowhere, and a decades-old secret that the most prominent families in Louisiana had conspired to bury. What perplexed investigators from the beginning was the single shoe, a woman's satin evening slipper, found in the middle of Royal Street, 3 blocks from the Rousseau home. It bore no signs of struggle, no marks of violence. It was simply abandoned, as if its owner had dissolved into the thick southern air. More curious still was the handkerchief discovered nearby, monogrammed with the initials J.R., and spotted not with blood, as one might expect, but with what appeared to be candle wax, and a substance later determined to be river clay. How had these items traveled so far from where the couple was last seen? And why did 6 separate witnesses claim to have heard a woman singing from inside the sealed wall of St. Louis Cathedral that same night? The Rousseau family history stretched back to the earliest days of French colonization. Georges Rousseau, Julien's grandfather, had arrived in Louisiana in 1724 with little more than ambition. By 1750, he had established a thriving enterprise shipping sugar, cotton, and indigo back to France. The family's fortunes grew alongside the city itself, their influence extending into banking, real estate, and local politics. By 1844, the Rousseaus were among the wealthiest families in New Orleans, their name synonymous with old money and even older power. Julien was the sole male heir. 26 years old, educated in Paris, and recently returned to assume his position in the family business. Those who knew him described a serious young man, methodical in his habits, reserved in his manner. He was neither particularly handsome nor especially charismatic, but his family name and fortune made him one of the most eligible bachelors in New Orleans society. According to family correspondence preserved in the Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane University, Julien was engaged to be married to Margaret Wilkinson, daughter of a prominent cotton broker, in the spring of 1845. Celestine Hartwell presented a more complicated portrait. Born to a French merchant and a free woman of color in 1820, she occupied the precarious social position of the gens de couleur libre, free people of color, in antebellum New Orleans. Records indicate she owned a small millinery shop on Conti Street, catering to both white and colored clientele of means. Her mother had died when she was 16, leaving her the business and a modest property near Rampart Street. By all accounts, Celestine was uncommonly beautiful, well-spoken, and literate in both English and French. How she came to be acquainted with Julien Rousseau remains unclear from the official record. What we do know, from the household staff who were the last to see them, is that on the evening of September 12th, Julien received a visitor shortly after 8 o'clock. The butler, Thomas Wells, admitted a woman wearing a dark blue dress and matching bonnet. She requested to speak with Monsieur Rousseau on a matter of business. Wells escorted her to the small parlor and informed his master of the visitor. According to Wells' statement to police, recorded on September 14th, Julien appeared surprised but not displeased. He instructed Wells to bring a tray with sherry and to ensure they would not be disturbed. At approximately 10:30 that evening, the housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, passing by the closed parlour door, heard low voices engaged in what she described as intense but not angry conversation. She noted that a lamp still burned in the room, visible from the crack beneath the door. This was the last confirmed sighting of either Julian Rousseau or Celestine Hartwell by the household staff. By morning, the parlour was empty. The sherry decanter contained only an inch of liquid. 2 glasses had been used. The lamp had burned out, having consumed all its oil. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry or exit. Both Julian and Celestine had simply vanished. The Rousseau family initially treated the matter as a private concern. Etienne Rousseau, Julien's father, questioned the staff but did not immediately alert authorities. It was only when Margaret Wilkinson's family inquired about Julian's absence from a scheduled luncheon on September 13th that the disappearance became more widely known. Even then, the family might have continued to handle the situation discreetly had it not been for the discovery of Julian's handkerchief and Celestine's shoe on Royal Street by a street vendor early on September 14th. The items were turned over to the City Watch, who recognized the Rousseau monogram and promptly notified the family. It was at this point that Etienne Rousseau reluctantly filed a missing persons report. The official search for Julien and Celestine had begun, but what would emerge from that search would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple disappearance, a web of relationships, resentments, and rituals that stretched back decades before either Julien or Celestine was born. The Rousseau home stood on land that had previously belonged to the Tremé plantation. Before that, according to municipal archives, it had been the site of a small settlement of Choctaw Indians. Local legend held that the ground was sacred or cursed, depending on who told the story. What is documented is that during the construction of the Rousseau home in 1791, workers uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 15 individuals. The discovery was quickly covered up, both literally and figuratively. Construction continued, and the incident was recorded only in the private journal of the architect François Latrobe, which remained undiscovered until 1963, when it was found during renovations to the Cabildo. The first month after the disappearance passed with no significant developments. The City Watch conducted perfunctory interviews with the household staff, business associates, and known acquaintances of both missing persons. Celestine's millinery shop remained closed, its inventory undisturbed. Julian's personal effects, including his pocket watch, correspondence, and portfolio of business documents, remained in his bedchamber. There were no unusual withdrawals from the Rousseau accounts at the Bank of Louisiana. It was as if neither party had planned for an extended absence. The case might have faded from public attention entirely had it not been for the persistence of a single individual, Father Antoine Mondelli, an Italian-born priest assigned to St. Louis Cathedral. Father Mondelli had come to know Celestine through her regular attendance at early morning Mass. In the letter to Bishop Antoine Blanc, dated October 22, 1844, Mondelli expressed concern about her disappearance, describing Celestine as a woman of genuine piety and steady habits, not given to impulsiveness or intrigue. He requested permission to make inquiries among his parishioners and to offer prayers for her safe return. What Father Mondelli discovered in the course of his unofficial investigation would later be compiled in a slim volume titled Notes on a Disappearance, which he never published, but which was preserved in the diocesan archives. Through conversations with Celestine's neighbors and clients, he pieced together a picture of her life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. According to multiple sources, Celestine had appeared increasingly anxious throughout the summer of 1844. She had been observed on several occasions in deep conversation with an elderly woman known locally as Madame Laveau, possibly related to the more famous Marie Laveau, though this connection remains unverified. More significantly, Father Mondelli uncovered evidence of a long-standing connection between Celestine and the Rousseau family. In his notes, he referenced a baptismal record from St. Louis Cathedral dated April 3, 1820. The entry recorded the baptism of Celestine, daughter of François Hartwell, and Dominique, a free woman of color. What drew Mondelli's attention was the name listed as godfather, Georges Rousseau, Julien's grandfather. This connection suggested a relationship between the families that extended back more than 2 decades before the disappearance. Father Mondelli's inquiries might have continued unimpeded had he not received an unexpected visitor at his modest quarters behind the cathedral. On the evening of November 9th, Etienne Rousseau himself called upon the priest. According to Mondelli's journal entry from that night, the conversation was brief but pointed. Rousseau expressed his appreciation for the priest's concern, but suggested that further investigation would only cause pain to both families. He implied that his son and Miss Hartwell had likely eloped to France or perhaps Cuba, and that discretion would best serve all parties. Before departing, he left a substantial donation for the cathedral's restoration fund. Father Mondelli noted that the amount, $500, was precisely the sum needed to complete repairs to the cathedral's north wall, where workers had recently reported hearing strange sounds at night. Following this visit, official interest in the case noticeably waned. The City Watch closed their investigation in December, citing lack of evidence of foul play. The Picayune published a brief notice stating that Julien Rousseau had reportedly been seen boarding a vessel bound for Marseille, though no passenger manifest ever confirmed this claim. Celestine's millinery shop was sold to settle unspecified debts. By early 1845, it seemed the mystery would remain unsolved, another strange footnote in the complicated social history of New Orleans. But beneath the surface of public record, other currents were moving. In January 1845, a fire broke out in the Rousseau home, destroying a portion of the east wing, including the parlor where Julien and Celestine had last been seen. The damage was contained before it could spread to the main structure, but the timing raised questions among those still following the case. More curious still was the discovery made during reconstruction. Workers uncovered a hidden door behind what had appeared to be a solid bookcase. The door opened onto a narrow passage that led to a small, windowless room containing only a single chair and an oil lamp fixed to the wall. The discovery was documented in the builder's report, but attracted little attention until 1861, when the Rousseau home was requisitioned for use as a Confederate officers' quarters during the Civil War. A Lieutenant James Metcalf from Virginia, assigned to catalogue the property's contents, noted the hidden room in his inventory and described a peculiar odor, not unpleasant but distinctive, resembling church incense mixed with river mud. He also observed scratches on the interior side of the hidden door, as might be made by a person attempting to exit. Metcalf's report was filed among hundreds of similar inventories and remained buried in military archives for nearly a century. Throughout the 1850s, the Rousseau family maintained their position in New Orleans society, though their influence gradually diminished. Etienne died in 1853, leaving the family businesses in the hands of his son-in-law, Thomas Beaumont, who had married Julien's sister Marie-Claire. The family narrative regarding Julien settled into a vague account of his having relocated to Europe after a failed romance. No correspondence from him ever surfaced, no confirmation of his existence in France or elsewhere. He was, for all practical purposes, a ghost, present in family portraits that still hung in the main hall, but absent from all living memory. Celestine Hartwell faded even more completely from the public record. Her name appeared in no census after 1840, no tax rolls, no parish registers. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole, leaving behind only a satin slipper on Royal Street as proof she had ever walked the cobblestones of New Orleans. The years passed. The Civil War transformed the social landscape of New Orleans and all of Louisiana. The Rousseau fortune, tied heavily to the institution of slavery, diminished significantly, but did not disappear entirely. The family home remained in their possession, though portions were sold off to satisfy debts. The hidden room, discovered during the 1845 reconstruction, was sealed up again during renovations in 1872, this time more thoroughly. A new wall was constructed, thicker than before, and the space was incorporated into an expanded kitchen area. If anyone in the family knew the significance of this architectural decision, they left no record of it. In 1891, nearly 50 years after the disappearance, an elderly woman named Sarah Johnson gave an interview to a journalist from the Times-Democrat who was collecting stories about antebellum New Orleans. Johnson had worked as a laundress for several prominent families, including the Rousseaus, from 1838 until emancipation. In her account, she mentioned a night in September 1844 when she was returning home late from delivering clean linens to the Wilkinson household. Passing near the Rousseau property around midnight, she observed two figures in the garden, a man and a woman, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation. The man, whom she identified as Julian Rousseau, was gesturing emphatically while the woman stood perfectly still, her back to Johnson. They were standing near the old well, which had been covered over years before but remained as a decorative feature in the garden. Johnson's account might have been dismissed as the confused recollections of an elderly woman had it not contained one detail that aligned with physical evidence discovered decades later. She described Julian as repeatedly pointing to a particular brick in the garden wall, a brick that appeared darker than those surrounding it. This detail would prove significant when, in 1927, a portion of that same garden wall collapsed during a heavy storm, revealing a small cavity containing a metal box. The box, severely corroded but intact, was discovered by workers repairing the wall. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the pages largely destroyed by moisture and time. Only fragments remained legible, but among them was a passage dated September 10, 1844, written in what experts would later confirm was Julian Rousseau's handwriting. The passage read, "C has confirmed what I have long suspected. The basement room beneath the east parlor connects to the old tunnel. Father must be confronted with this knowledge, though I fear his reaction." The documents C, discovered in her mother's effects, leave no doubt about the events of 1820. Tomorrow I will speak with him directly. What events of 1820 might Julian have been referencing? Historical records indicate that year marked several significant occurrences in New Orleans history. A yellow fever epidemic that claimed nearly 2,000 lives, the completion of the first steamship voyage up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico, and the implementation of stricter legal codes governing the activities of free people of color. It was also, according to baptismal records, the year of Celestine Hartwell's birth. The connections between these facts remained tenuous until 1959, when excavations for a new sewer line along Bourbon Street unearthed a section of previously unknown tunnel approximately 9 feet below street level. The tunnel, roughly 3 feet in height and 2 feet wide, extended for nearly 30 yards before collapse made further exploration impossible. City engineers determined it had once connected to the basement of what had been the Rousseau property, by then converted into a hotel. Analysis of the construction methods dated the tunnel to approximately 1810 to 1820, the period when Georges Rousseau, Julien's grandfather, was at the height of his power and influence. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the long-forgotten disappearance. A graduate student at Tulane University, Martha Gallagher, chose the Rousseau-Hartwell case as the subject of her thesis in historical anthropology. Through meticulous research in municipal archives, church records, and private collections, Gallagher assembled the most comprehensive account to date of the events surrounding September 12, 1844. Her work, completed in 1962 but never published commercially, suggested a narrative far more complex and disturbing than a simple elopement or even a conventional murder. According to Gallagher's research, the connection between the Rousseau and Hartwell families extended back to Celestine's birth and likely earlier. Georges Rousseau's appearance as godfather at her baptism was unusual for a man of his standing, particularly for the child of a free woman of color. Gallagher discovered evidence in notarial records that Dominique Hartwell, Celestine's mother, had previously been owned by the Rousseau family before being granted her freedom in 1817. The circumstances of this manumission were not recorded, but Gallagher noted a significant financial transaction between Georges Rousseau and François Hartwell, Celestine's father, dated 3 months before Dominique's freedom was secured. More revealing still was Gallagher's discovery of a series of payments from the Rousseau family to Dominique Hartwell, beginning in 1820 and continuing until her death in 1836. These payments, recorded in Georges Rousseau's private ledger, now held in the historic New Orleans collection, were substantial, $50 quarterly, at a time when a skilled tradesman might earn $200 annually. The ledger listed the payments under the heading Maintenance of Family Obligations, a phrase Georges used elsewhere to refer to legitimate family expenses. The implication was clear, but remained circumstantial. Celestine Hartwell was almost certainly Georges Rousseau's natural daughter. This would have made her Julien's aunt, though the age difference between them was only 6 years. Such arrangements were not uncommon in the complex racial hierarchy of antebellum New Orleans, where wealthy white men frequently maintained second families with free women of color, sometimes providing for their mixed-race children through indirect means while never publicly acknowledging them. What made the Rousseau-Hartwell case unusual was the apparent breakdown of this unspoken social compact. Gallagher's thesis suggested that Celestine had somehow discovered documentation of her parentage, possibly through papers left by her mother, and had approached Julien with this information. Whether this approach was motivated by a desire for recognition, financial support, or some form of justice remains unclear. What happened next is where the historical record gives way to speculation, though Gallagher's careful research provides several compelling possibilities. The discovery of the tunnel connecting the Rousseau basement to a point several blocks away suggested a means by which Julien and Celestine might have left the house unobserved on the night of September 12th. The tunnel's terminus was near the Mississippi riverfront, where numerous vessels docked daily, offering potential escape from the city. Yet if they had planned to flee together, why was Celestine's slipper found in the opposite direction, on Royal Street? And why would Julien have left behind all his personal effects, including items necessary for travel? An alternative theory emerged from Gallagher's examination of Etienne Rousseau's activities in the days following the disappearance. Bank records indicated an unusual withdrawal of $3,000, a substantial sum in 1844, on September 13th, the day after Julien and Celestine vanished. The following day, Etienne met privately with Judge William Harper, who had long-standing financial ties to the Rousseau family. 3 days later, the city watch officer initially assigned to investigate the disappearance was reassigned to patrol duty in the Tremé district, far from the French Quarter. These circumstances, while not definitive, suggested a deliberate effort to influence the official response to the disappearance. Whether Etienne was protecting his son from scandal, covering up a crime committed by or against him, or executing a more sinister plan of his own devising, the evidence does not conclusively establish. What Gallagher did establish, through property records, was that Etienne Rousseau purchased a small parcel of land in St. Bernard Parish on September 20th, 1844, just over a week after the disappearance. The land, located in a remote area near Bayou Country, contained nothing but an abandoned sugar mill. Etienne never developed the property, and it was sold after his death in 1853. No record exists of any investigation of the site in connection with the disappearance. The most disturbing evidence uncovered by Gallagher came from an unexpected source: the personal diary of Margaret Wilkinson, Julian's fiancée. The diary, preserved by Wilkinson's descendants and made available to Gallagher through a fortuitous family connection, contained entries spanning from January 1844 to December 1845. The entry, dated September 10th, 2 days before the disappearance, recorded a troubling interaction with Julian. Margaret wrote, "Jay called today in a state of great agitation. He spoke at length about family legacy and blood relations, much of it incomprehensible. He mentioned a woman named Celestine, saying she possessed documents that would bring down the house of Rousseau. When I pressed for explanation, he became evasive, apologized for his manner, and departed abruptly. I fear his time in Paris has unsettled his mind." This entry aligned with the fragment found in Julian's journal, referring to documents C discovered and his intention to confront his father. It suggested that whatever information Celestine had uncovered, Julian found it sufficiently credible and disturbing to consider it a threat to his family's position. The nature of this information, beyond the likely fact of Celestine's parentage, remains the central mystery of the case. Gallagher's thesis presented several possibilities, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none definitively proven. The most straightforward explanation was that Celestine had discovered not only that Georges Rousseau was her biological father, but that he had maintained her mother, Dominique, in a relationship that was less than fully consensual, despite her technical status as a free woman. Such a revelation, particularly if documented, could have damaged the Rousseau family's standing in New Orleans society and potentially exposed them to legal consequences. A more complex possibility emerged from Gallagher's examination of the tunnel connecting the Rousseau basement to the riverfront. City records indicated that similar tunnels had been discovered beneath other properties owned by prominent families with ties to the transatlantic trade. Some historical evidence suggests these tunnels were used not only for the conventional smuggling of goods to avoid Spanish and later American customs duties, but also for the clandestine transportation of human cargo, enslaved people brought into Louisiana during periods when the legal trade was restricted. Georges Rousseau's business records, while meticulously maintained regarding his legitimate enterprises, contained noticeable gaps during certain periods between 1810 and 1820, particularly surrounding transactions involving vessels arriving from Cuba and Brazil. These gaps coincided with a significant expansion of his plantation holdings and accompanying increase in enslaved workforce. If Georges had been involved in illegal slave trading during this period, and if Celestine had discovered documentation of this fact, the threat to the family would have extended beyond social embarrassment to potential criminal prosecution and financial ruin. The most disturbing theory proposed by Gallagher, one she approached with appropriate scholarly caution, concerned the mass grave discovered during the construction of the Rousseau home in 1791. The architect's journal, found during the 1963 renovations to the Cabildo, described the remains as arranged in a manner suggesting ceremonial purpose rather than expedient disposal. The journal noted that Georges Rousseau had personally supervised the reburial of the remains in an unspecified location, and had sworn the workers to secrecy with both financial incentives and veiled threats. If Celestine had somehow discovered information connecting her biological father to these remains and their treatment, it might explain the extreme response her approach apparently provoked. It might also explain the hidden room behind the bookcase, the tunnel leading to the river, and the parcel of land purchased by Etienne Rousseau in the days following the disappearance. Each of these elements suggested not just concealment of a crime, but systematic infrastructure for activities that needed to remain hidden from public view. Martha Gallagher's thesis was submitted in June 1962 and received high praise from her academic advisors. She was encouraged to develop the work into a book for commercial publication. In September of that year, she traveled to St. Bernard Parish to investigate the property purchased by Etienne Rousseau after the disappearance. Parish records indicate she obtained permission to conduct a preliminary archaeological survey of the site. She was accompanied by a graduate student in archaeology, Robert Kleinman. Neither Gallagher nor Kleinman returned from this expedition. Their vehicle was found abandoned near the property. Despite an extensive search by local authorities, no trace of either researcher was ever found. The investigation into their disappearance remained open for 7 years before being classified as cold. During that time, Gallagher's thesis materials were gathered as potential evidence, then sealed as part of the ongoing investigation. When the case was finally closed in 1969, her research was transferred to the university archives, but remained restricted under the terms of a legal agreement between the university and an unnamed third party. It was not until 2004 that a Freedom of Information Act request finally made her work available to researchers, though certain sections dealing with specific land records in St. Bernard Parish remained redacted for reasons never publicly explained. In the decades since Gallagher's disappearance, the Rousseau-Hartwell case has attracted sporadic attention from historians, paranormal investigators, and true crime enthusiasts. The Rousseau home, after passing through various owners, was eventually converted into a small hotel in the 1980s, capitalizing on the property's haunted reputation. Guests occasionally report strange sounds emanating from the walls, particularly in rooms constructed over what was once the East Wing. During renovations in 1997, workers claimed to uncover a sealed cavity containing a woman's slipper, similar to the one found on Royal Street in 1844, though no physical evidence was preserved to verify this claim. The millinery shop, once owned by Celestine Hartwell on Conti Street, has long since been replaced by newer construction, though a historical marker installed in 2008 acknowledges her as an example of the entrepreneurial free women of color who contributed to New Orleans' unique cultural landscape. The marker makes no mention of her disappearance or her connection to the Rousseau family. St. Bernard Parish, including the property once briefly owned by Etienne Rousseau, suffered extensive damage during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The abandoned sugar mill that had stood on the site for over 150 years was completely destroyed. In the aftermath of the storm, as crews worked to clear debris, a local resident reported finding a small metal object that appeared to be a key, stamped with the letter R. The item was turned over to parish authorities, but subsequently went missing from the evidence room before it could be properly examined or authenticated. The full truth of what happened to Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell on the night of September 12, 1844, will likely never be known with certainty. The physical evidence has largely been lost to time, intentional destruction, and natural disaster. The written record remains fragmentary, much of it filtered through the biases and limited perspectives of the era. What we are left with is a portrait in negative space, the outline of two lives and the powerful social forces that apparently conspired to erase them. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the case is how quickly it faded from public consciousness in its own time. Despite involving a prominent family and unusual circumstances, the disappearance received minimal newspaper coverage and generated little official response. This silence speaks to the power structures at work in antebellum New Orleans, where certain questions simply could not be asked, certain connections not acknowledged, certain truths not spoken aloud, and yet the story refuses to disappear entirely. It survives in fragments of journals, in architectural anomalies, in oral histories passed down through generations of New Orleans residents. It survives in the persistent questions raised by researchers like Martha Gallagher, even as they themselves become part of the mystery. Most of all, it survives in the uncomfortable space between historical fact and speculation, in the shadowland where documented evidence meets the limits of what a society is willing to acknowledge about its own past. In the end, perhaps the most accurate memorial to Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell is not a historical marker or academic thesis, but the persistent echo of their absence, a silence that, over time, has become more eloquent than words. In a city built on stories, theirs remains unfinished, a narrative thread that leads into darkness and never emerges again. For those who listen closely enough, that silence still speaks from the hidden rooms, sealed tunnels, and unmarked graves of New Orleans, bearing witness to what happens when powerful men decide that certain truths must never come to light. The sound of their footsteps on cobblestone streets has long since faded. The candlelight that illuminated their final known conversation has been extinguished for over a century and a half, but in the collective memory of the city that forgot them, something remains, a shadow on the wall, a whisper in the courtyard, the faint impression of a slipper abandoned on Royal Street, waiting for its owner to return and claim it. She never did. In 1968, almost a century and a quarter after the disappearance, a retired librarian named Eleanor Whitfield made a discovery while cataloging a collection of personal papers donated to the Louisiana Historical Society. Among materials belonging to the Beaumont family, descendants of Marie-Claire Rousseau and her husband Thomas, was a slim volume bound in faded red leather. The volume contained household accounts from 1843 to 1845, maintained by Marie-Claire herself. Most entries were mundane: purchases of fabric, payment to servants, costs of entertaining. But a single entry, dated September 13, 1844, the day after Julian and Celestine vanished, stood out for its cryptic nature. Payment to Dr. Vernon for night services and discretion, $150. The substantial amount, equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled worker, suggested services far beyond routine medical care. Dr. James Vernon, as Whitfield discovered through further research, was not primarily a physician to the living. His main practice involved preparing bodies for burial, what would now be considered the work of a mortician. That the Rousseau family would summon such a practitioner in the dead of night and pay handsomely for his discretion raised disturbing questions about the events of September 12th. Whitfield's discovery might have led to renewed investigation of the case had she not suffered a stroke shortly after documenting her findings. She died 3 weeks later, leaving her notes incomplete and unorganized. The red leather volume was returned to the Beaumont collection, where it remained uncatalogued for another decade due to staffing limitations at the Historical Society. When the collection was finally processed in the late 1970s, the account book was listed in the inventory, but its significance went unrecognized. The reference to Dr. Vernon was buried among hundreds of similar entries, its connection to the Rousseau-Hartwell disappearance once again lost to institutional oversight. This pattern of evidence emerging briefly before being obscured again has characterized the case from its inception, It suggests not a supernatural curse, as local ghost tours might imply, but something perhaps more unsettling, a persistent social mechanism that functions to conceal certain types of historical truth. The disappearance of Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell occurred at the intersection of race, class, family, and power in a society structured around maintaining rigid boundaries between these categories. Any genuine investigation threatened to expose not just individual wrongdoing, but the functioning of the system itself. In 1982, during renovation of St. Louis Cathedral, workers discovered a small cavity in the north wall, the same wall Father Mondelli had sought funds to repair in 1844. Inside was a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a young woman whose features suggested mixed European and African ancestry. The reverse side bore an inscription, "CH, until we meet in a better world." Cathedral records indicate the discovery was turned over to the archdiocese, but subsequent inquiries by researchers have been unable to locate the item in diocesan archives. A church representative stated in 2012 that no record exists of such an object ever being found. The decades passed. New Orleans weathered storms, both meteorological and social. The French Quarter, once the domain of families like the Rousseau, transformed into a tourist destination where the city's complex history was simultaneously celebrated and sanitized for mass consumption. Ghost tours included the Rousseau home on their routes, though the stories told by guides often bore little resemblance to the documented facts of the case. In the popular imagination, Julian and Celestine became tragic lovers whose romance defied the conventions of their time, a narrative more palatable than the possibility that their disappearance represented something far darker about the society that produced them. In 2015, a graduate student in forensic anthropology at Tulane University, Darius Washington, undertook a modern analysis of the limited physical evidence associated with the case. Working from photographs and descriptions of items that had long since disappeared, Washington applied contemporary methodologies to historical materials. His findings, published in the Journal of Forensic Anthropology, suggested that the river clay found on Julian's handkerchief was consistent with soil from a very specific area, a section of riverbank near what had once been a private docking facility owned by the Rousseau family. This location was less than a quarter-mile from where the underground tunnel discovered in 1959 would have emerged. Washington's research also examined architectural plans of the Rousseau home, comparing the original blueprints with subsequent renovations. He identified a discrepancy in the dimensions of the basement level before and after 1845, the year of the fire that damaged the East Wing. The post-fire plans showed a basement approximately 15 feet shorter along its eastern wall than in the original design, suggesting that a portion of the subterranean space had been deliberately sealed off during reconstruction. This sealed area would have connected directly to the tunnel leading toward the river. Most significantly, Washington analyzed the fragmentary journal entry found in the metal box discovered in 1927. Using digital enhancement techniques, he was able to recover portions of text previously thought illegible. Among these recovered fragments was a partial sentence. "Grandfather's involvement in the rituals beneath the house must be exposed regardless of the cost to our family name." This tantalizing reference aligned with the architect's journal description of the mass grave discovered during construction as having a ceremonial arrangement. Washington's work provided the most substantial advancement in understanding the case since Martha Gallagher's ill-fated research in the 1960s. Unlike Gallagher, Washington did not attempt to visit the St. Bernard Parish property, focusing instead on analysis of historical records and surviving evidence. His research stopped short of drawing definitive conclusions about the fate of Julian and Celestine, presenting multiple scenarios consistent with the available evidence. In the most benign interpretation, Julian and Celestine, perhaps half-siblings through their connection to Georges Rousseau, fled New Orleans together after Julian's confrontation with his father revealed the family's unwillingness to acknowledge their kinship. They escaped through the tunnel to the river, where a boat was waiting to carry them to a new life elsewhere. The items found on Royal Street were planted to mislead searchers, while the payment to Dr. Vernon was for some unrelated service. In this scenario, they lived out their lives in anonymity, perhaps in a northern state or foreign country where their relationship would not be scrutinized. A darker possibility, and one more consistent with the evidence of hasty concealment and paid discretion, is that either Julian or Celestine or both met with violence on the night of September 12th. The tunnel provided not an escape route, but a means of removing evidence from the Rousseau home. The property in St. Bernard Parish, purchased days after the disappearance, offered a remote location for disposal of remains. The payment to Dr. Vernon covered not routine medical services, but the discreet handling of a body or bodies. The fire that conveniently destroyed the east wing of the house 3 months later eliminated any remaining physical evidence at the primary scene. Most disturbing of all is the possibility that their disappearance was connected to whatever rituals beneath the house Julian referenced in his journal. The mass grave discovered during construction, the tunnel system connecting prominent homes to the riverfront, the carefully maintained silence of authorities, these elements suggest practices more organized and enduring than individual acts of violence. If Julian had indeed discovered documentation of his grandfather's involvement in such activities, and if Celestine possessed additional evidence through papers inherited from her mother, they may have threatened to expose not just family secrets, but crimes involving multiple prominent citizens. In this context, their disappearance reads less as a personal tragedy and more as an act of institutional self-preservation, the system protecting itself against exposure. The rapid closing of the official investigation, the family's construction of a false narrative about Julian relocating to France, the physical sealing of spaces connected to the events, all point to a calculated response designed to erase not just two individuals, but the questions their existence raised about the society itself. Washington's research, while methodologically sound, encountered many of the same obstacles that had impeded previous investigations. Key documents remained missing or restricted, physical evidence had been lost or destroyed, witnesses were long dead. The St. Bernard Parish property, which might have yielded forensic evidence, had been scoured by Hurricane Katrina. Even the original Rousseau home had been so extensively modified over the decades that it retained little of its original interior structure. What remained was a constellation of suggestive facts orbiting around an absence, the documented non-existence of two people who had once lived, worked, and moved through the streets of New Orleans. In October 2019, a descendant of the Beaumont family granted access to a previously unpublished collection of letters written by Marie-Claire Rousseau to her daughter Élise between 1860 and 1870. In a letter dated March 12, 1867, Marie-Claire made a cryptic reference to her brother. "Today would have been Julien's 50th birthday. I still dream of him sometimes, standing by the old well in the garden, trying to tell me something I cannot quite hear. Father took the truth of that night to his grave, and perhaps it is better so. Some burdens are too heavy for the next generation to carry." This passage, the only reference to Julian in all of Marie-Claire's surviving correspondence, suggests she believed her brother was deceased rather than living abroad. More tellingly, it implies that Etienne Rousseau possessed definitive knowledge about the events of September 1844 that he never shared even with his remaining children. The reference to the garden well aligns with Sarah Johnson's account of seeing Julian and a woman near that location on the night of the disappearance, lending credibility to her testimony. The well itself features in another piece of evidence discovered in 2021. During a routine digitization project, archivists at the Historic New Orleans Collection found an invoice from a construction firm dated October 1844, billing Etienne Rousseau for filling and sealing of garden well with additional reinforcement as specified. The work, completed just weeks after the disappearance, involved not simply covering the well, but filling it entirely with a mixture of crushed stone, lime and cement, an unusually thorough and permanent method of decommissioning what had been a functional water source for the household. The convergence of these details, Marie Claire's reference to Julian by the well, Sarah Johnson's sighting of the couple in the same location, and the subsequent permanent sealing of the structure, points to the garden well as a site of particular significance in the case, yet no investigation ever focused on this location. By the time historians recognized its potential importance, the well had been sealed for over a century and a half, and the property had undergone multiple renovations that likely obliterated any remaining evidence. The Rousseau-Hartwell case illustrates how effectively the passage of time can obscure even events of significant historical interest. With each generation, memories fade, records disappear, and physical spaces transform. The landscape of evidence erodes until what remains is insufficient to support definitive conclusions. This erosion is rarely neutral or random. It often follows patterns that protect certain interests while exposing others. In New Orleans, as in many places, the stories that survive tend to be those that powerful institutions and families allowed to survive. What happened to Julian Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell on September 12, 1844? The most likely scenario, based on the accumulation of fragmentary evidence across nearly 2 centuries, is that they died that night or shortly thereafter, their bodies disposed of with the assistance of Dr. Vernon and possibly buried or concealed on the remote property in St. Bernard Parish. Their deaths were almost certainly connected to information they had discovered about Georges Rousseau's activities, information threatening enough to warrant extreme measures to prevent its disclosure. The family's subsequent actions, sealing off portions of the house, filling in the well, constructing a false narrative about Julian's relocation, ensuring that Celestine's name faded from public record, all suggest a deliberate effort to erase not just the event, but the questions it raised. Yet despite this erasure, traces remain: a handkerchief on Royal Street, a slipper found decades later in a sealed wall, a hidden tunnel leading to the river, a journal fragment mentioning rituals beneath the house, a payment for night services and discretion, a locket inscribed with the initials CH, a well filled with stone and lime. Together, these fragments outline a shape that, while incomplete, suggests something more methodical than a crime of passion or a thwarted elopement. They point to a calculated response to a perceived threat, the threat of exposure. What truth was so dangerous that it required the disappearance of 2 people and the construction of an elaborate false narrative? The historical context offers several possibilities: illegal slave trading during a period of restriction, exploitation of women legally designated as free but practically constrained by social and economic forces, ritualistic practices connected to the mass grave discovered during construction, or perhaps some combination of these elements. Whatever the specific nature of this truth, it implicated not just Georges and Etienne Rousseau, but potentially other prominent families connected to their business and social circles. In this light, The disappearance of Julien and Celestine represents not just a personal tragedy, but a moment when the machinery of historical erasure becomes visible in operation. It shows us how effectively power can silence inconvenient truths, how physical spaces can be reconstructed to eliminate evidence, how official records can be shaped to support preferred narratives, how social pressure can discourage uncomfortable questions. Most disturbingly, it demonstrates how these mechanisms can function without explicit conspiracy, how individuals acting to protect family interests, institutions maintaining their authority, and social conventions enforcing their boundaries can collectively produce a silence that persists across centuries. The final word on the case might best be left to Martha Gallagher, whose unpublished notes, discovered among her effects after her disappearance, included this observation: the most effective erasure is not the destruction of evidence, but the destruction of the question itself, the cultivation of a social environment where certain inquiries are simply not made, where certain connections are not drawn, where certain possibilities are not articulated. In New Orleans of 1844, the questions that might have revealed the truth about Julien Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell were questions that could not be asked within the framework of the society itself. This silence was not an aberration, but a feature of the system functioning as designed. Gallagher's insight applies not only to antebellum New Orleans, but to our own relationship with difficult historical truths. The disappearance of Julien and Celestine occurred at the intersection of racial hierarchy, family power, economic interest, and social convention. The mechanisms that obscured their fate, selective documentation, physical concealment, narrative construction, institutional pressure, continue to shape which aspects of our past remain visible and which fade into silence. In this sense, their story is not finished, not fully told, not completely heard. It continues to unfold whenever we confront the gaps in our historical record and recognize them not as neutral absences, but as silences with their own complex histories. Histories that speak volumes about what societies choose to remember and what they work to forget. On September 12, 1844, two people vanished from a house in New Orleans. Nearly 2 centuries later, their absence still echoes through the historical record, raising questions that no single discipline, neither history nor archaeology, neither forensic science nor archival research, can fully answer. Their story persists in the margins of documents, in the anomalies of architecture, in the contradictions of family narratives. It persists because erasure, however methodical, is never complete. Something always remains: a handkerchief, a slipper, a fragment of text, a payment record. And as long as these fragments exist, the questions they raise will continue to disturb the carefully constructed silences of history. In a city built on stories, the untold story of Julien Rousseau and Celestine Hartwell may be the most eloquent of all, a narrative defined by its absences, its erasures, its deliberate silences. Those silences, once we learn to hear them, speak with a clarity that no preserved document could match. They tell us not just about two people who disappeared on a September night, but about the society that made their disappearance possible and then worked so diligently to forget them. In this forgetting, selective, strategic, sustained, we glimpse the machinery of history itself, sorting human lives into those worth remembering and those consigned to silence. But silence, paradoxically, can become its own kind of testimony. The very effort to erase Julien and Celestine has preserved them in a different form, as a question that refuses to be answered, a story that refuses to be concluded, a truth that refuses to remain buried. In their absence, they have become more present than many of their contemporaries, whose lives left fuller traces in the historical record. They persist precisely because of the energy expended to make them disappear. Perhaps this persistence is the closest thing to justice they will ever receive, not the resolution of their case or the definitive establishment of facts, but the simple acknowledgement that their lives mattered enough that powerful forces mobilized to erase them, and that, despite these efforts, they are still here, still raising questions, still disturbing comfortable narratives about the past. In a society built on enforced forgetting, remembrance itself becomes a form of resistance. And so we remember Julian and Celestine, not as the fully realized individuals they once were, but as the questions they became. Questions that continue to echo through the hidden rooms, sealed tunnels, and filled-in wells of New Orleans, bearing witness to what happens when truth becomes too dangerous to acknowledge. The sound of their footsteps on cobblestone streets has long since faded. The candlelight that illuminated their final known conversation has been extinguished for over a century and a half, but in the collective memory of the city that forgot them, something remains, a shadow on the wall, a whisper in the courtyard, the faint impression of a slipper abandoned on Royal Street, waiting for its owner to return and claim it. She never did. And in that unclaimed slipper, that unfinished journey that interrupted life, we find not just the story of one woman and one man in 19th century New Orleans, but a reflection of all the stories our society has deemed too dangerous to remember, and a reminder that no erasure, however thorough, can ever be complete.